All right, great. Well, welcome everybody to this evening's special Zoom presentation, Miami's Untouchable, Al Capone in South Florida. There has been a lot of interest in Al Capone lately, given the threat of demolition that happened to his home in South Florida. A couple months back, there was a request by the new owners to demolish a property. And since then, there has been a lot of interest from really across the nation in Al Capone and in the efforts to save the home from demolition. A petition was started and so far has over 25,000 signatures in support of preserving this home. And since then, the prior owners withdrew their requests for demolition and sold the property. We are now in the process of reaching out to the new owners to encourage them to preserve this very important part of American history. And so we're very honored this evening to have our featured speaker, A. Brad Schwartz, who is a doctoral candidate in American history with a special interest in questions of media and journalism, law and policing, and the cultural production of history. And he's doing his doctoral candidacy at Princeton University. His undergraduate thesis was at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and it explored Orson Welles' 1938 War of the Worlds radio broadcast, drawing upon an untapped trove of listener letters to challenge the standard narrative of the so-called panic broadcast. This research became the basis for his first book, Broadcast Hysteria, Orson Welles' War of the Worlds and the Art of Fake News, which was published in 2015 by Hill and Wang. In 2013, he co-wrote a documentary about War of the Worlds for the PBS series American Experience, based in part on his thesis research. And his second book, Scarface and the Untouchable, Al Capone, Eliot Ness, and the Battle for Chicago, co-written with Max Allan Collins, was published by William Morrow in 2018. And so we are very delighted and honored to have Brad here. We also wanted to mention that for those of you on Zoom, you can ask your questions in the chat or the Q&A, and we will make sure at the end of the presentation to ask those questions of Brad. So let's all give a virtual round of applause. Welcome, Brad.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you to the, am I on the main screen here yet?
There we go, yes.
Great. Thank you, Daniel, and the Miami Design Preservation League, and to all of you for tuning in. It's great to see so many people, not just on the Zoom here, but taking an interest in preserving Al Capone's former home on Miami Beach. It's been, when my co-author Max Allan Collins and I first got the idea of tackling this story as a nonfiction work, we did it because we were concerned about some misapprehensions, some ways that it had been distorted in the popular media, and wanted to try and get through the mythology and research what had actually happened. And one of the great unexpected privileges of doing that work, which seemed initially that we were sort of on our own, but particularly since the book has come out, we've gotten to know people all around the country who care about this history, who care about preserving it and contextualizing it, not just in places like Chicago, but in Washington, D.C., and in Pennsylvania. And I'm thrilled to be able to add Daniel and the folks in Miami Beach to that list. We got connected around the recent controversy that he talked about the potential demolition of the house on Palm Island. And it's always great to see people coming together to preserve the history of their community, and the advocacy, the organization. Again, 25,000 signatures on the petition is just incredible. So I feel lucky to have joined in that effort, and I'm equally grateful to be joining you all tonight for this talk. I hope everybody now can see, the PowerPoint that I put together. Maybe Daniel can give me a thumbs up on Zoom if we're coming through. But we're here to talk about Al Capone, his life in Florida and around Miami Beach. And we're here on a very special evening. As I'm speaking to you now, it's the 90th anniversary, almost to the hour, of Al Capone's conviction for income tax evasion. 90 years ago, right at this minute, the jury were deliberating around 9:30 Central Time, so 8:30 or 10:30 Eastern. They came in with their verdict. Capone, of course, went to trial in Chicago, and that's the city that he's still most associated with. His name is indelibly linked with that city. People from Chicago, anywhere they go in the world, chances are, if they say they're from Chicago, people will bring up Al Capone. And since the subject of this talk, as we saw, is Capone's life in Florida, you might think that his trial up north is, somewhat beside the point, or not connected, perhaps. But these two stories, the story of Al Capone in Florida and the story of his downfall, are really intertwined. You can't understand what happened in Chicago without understanding what happened in Miami Beach, and the reverberations of that, the ramifications of Al Capone's encounter with the federal government continue to shape our lives today in ways that you might not expect. So this is a big and important story, and it comes down, at least initially, to the question of where did this individual call home? Because Chicago, I think, would not be the place. Of course, one way you could define home is someone's hometown, where they originally came from. Al Capone was born in Brooklyn, New York, January 17th, 1899, the fourth child of Italian immigrant parents. This house right here, 21 Garfield Place in Brooklyn, is not his birthplace. That no longer stands, but it is one of his childhood homes, on the street where he grew up with his three elder brothers, and where his father worked as a barber. This is the territory that really made Al Capone what he became. Park Slope is a rather trendy neighborhood today. It was not back then. It could be a rather rough part of the city. Kids often had to join street gangs for protection, but Capone made the uncommon decision to go pro. And he was sort of following the lead of the local criminal godfather in the vicinity, John Torrio, who had an office not far from the Capone home here. And Capone would have perhaps passed it every day when he was going to school and seeing the life that he was going to end up pursuing as an adult. But Capone left Brooklyn around the time he turned 20, and eventually settled his family here at 7244 South Prairie Avenue in Chicago. This type of home, which still stands, is called a two-flat, and they're very common on the south side of Chicago. Typically, the homeowner lives on one floor and rents the other out to bring in some extra income. But Capone moved his whole family in here, mother, wife, siblings. As you can see, it's a rather sort of small and modest house for such a large family, but it became the Capone family homestead in Chicago, his sort of primary address, the place where they'd get together for big Sunday dinners. But it wasn't a place where Capone spent a lot of time in his heyday. He could rarely be found there, in the 1920s and 30s, because he mostly lived and ran his business from hotels and safe houses elsewhere. No, if Capone had a home, it was here. I think 93 Palm Avenue on Palm Island in Miami Beach. Clarence Bush, a local realtor who was involved in the development of Palm Island, had the house built in, I believe, 1922. Capone bought it in 1928 in his wife's name for $40,000. That would translate to about $640,000 today. So judging by its current market value, he got a very good deal. It's not a large property. The lot is only about 300 by 100 feet, 30,000 square feet, I believe. But it has 14 rooms, and the largest private swimming pool in the state at that time. As you can see, I was lucky enough to visit the place a few years ago, back when I was researching Scarface and the Untouchable, and the owners at that time were kind enough to give me a tour and show me around. I didn't swim in the pool, unfortunately, but I enjoyed my visit. So to make the place his own, Capone made renovations that cost more than $100,000. At that time, that would be about 1.6 million today. He added the cabana that you see here, as well as a concrete fence and other security features that turned this home into something of a secure compound. Apart from few lengthy stints behind bars, Capone treated this as his primary residence after 1928. His wife relocated there permanently, at least in part to get away from her mother-in-law, and his son largely grew up there. It's where Capone returned after his release from federal prison to live out the remainder of his life. More than any surviving structure, I think Capone left the mark of his personality on this home. If you're fortunate enough to go there today, of course, the property has changed. The trees have grown a lot larger. So you feel much more isolated than you actually are on Palm Island. But it's very easy to imagine that he's just around the next corner. So it's really sort of a fascinating time capsule in a lot of ways. But how did a street kid from Brooklyn make it from Garfield Place to Palm Island? Well, the answer, of course, is prohibition. The 18th Amendment to the US Constitution prohibiting the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquor went into effect on January 17th, 1920, just over 100 years ago, which also happened to be Al Capone's 21st birthday. Around the country, Americans marked the start of the dry era with events like this one, a mock funeral for John Barleycorn there. But reports of alcohol's demise were sorely premature. The 18th Amendment didn't eliminate the market for beverage alcohol. It merely turned it into a black market, handing it over to anyone willing to break the law in order to meet the continuing demand. This represented a golden opportunity for criminal organizations that had already developed in just about every major city in the United States. Before Prohibition, these gangs tended to be small and localized, in charge of running vice and other rackets within their particular territory. But because of Prohibition, they moved to take over the production and distribution of alcohol, using their pre-existing relationships with law enforcement and local government to ensure that they could operate without interference. This brought an enormous influx of new money into the underground economy, but it also required new levels of organization, with gangsters in different cities having to cooperate across state lines and across international borders when bringing liquor in from Canada or elsewhere. Prohibition, in short, turned organized crime into very big business. And one of the first gangsters to recognize the opportunity that this presented was John Torrio, Al Capone's mentor and role model from Brooklyn there on the left. When Prohibition took effect, Torrio had relocated to Chicago, and he was instrumental in rebuilding the rackets there along corporate lines, creating a criminal organization that came to be known as the Chicago Outfit. Capone in those days, as you can see, was still a young roughneck who served as Torrio's enforcer. But in 1925, after barely surviving an attempt on his own life, Torrio put Capone, then only 26 years old, in charge of running the whole outfit. Still, Torrio wasn't about to disappear into retirement. He maintained a business relationship with the gang and his former protege that included some ventures, where else, in the Sunshine State. So Torrio and Capone apparently started purchasing land around St. Petersburg, Florida in about 1925. This was during the height of the Florida land boom, a period of intense real estate speculation as people bought up land all over the state, often sight unseen, thinking that they could flip it for a profit. And for a while they could. Land values increased exponentially in a brief period of time, even for property that might otherwise have been worthless. I mean, beachfront property, quote unquote, could be 5 or 10 miles from the shore. So the boom, reshaped the geography of Florida, bringing in new money and new people, but it also created a speculative bubble that would inevitably burst. The whole phenomenon was really sort of emblematic of the Roaring Twenties, a manifestation, as the economist John Kenneth Galbraith put it, of the innately American desire to get rich quickly with a minimum of physical effort. And it warned of bigger crashes to come. But most Americans in the 1920s failed to heed that warning. Now, back in Chicago, Capone was growing tired of the climate, both the brutal winters and the vicious fighting between bootleg gangs that came to be known as the Beer Wars. Shortly before Christmas 1927, after Capone's efforts to negotiate a citywide peace treaty failed to stop the constant attempts on his life, he told the press that he was getting out. "I'm leaving for St. Petersburg, Florida tomorrow," he said. "Let the worthy citizens of Chicago get their liquor the best they can. I'm sick of the job. It's a thankless one and full of grief. I don't know when I'll get back, if ever, but it won't be until after the holidays anyway." "Well," he added, "tell the folks I'm going away now. I guess murder will stop. There won't be any more booze. You won't be able to find a crap game even, let alone a roulette wheel or a faro game. Say the coppers won't have to lay all the gang murders on me now. Maybe they'll find a new hero for the headlines. It would be a shame, wouldn't it, if while I was away, they could forget about me and find a new gangland chief." So, like a lot of Al Capone's public statements, this one should be taken with a large dose of salt. He didn't actually go to St. Petersburg. He took a brief trip to Los Angeles, where he was so hounded by press and police that he never left his hotel, the Biltmore here, before local law enforcement kicked him out of the city. "Why should everybody in this town pick on me?" Capone complained. "I wasn't going to do anything here. We are tourists, and I thought that you folks liked tourists." So the next time Capone decided to try and escape winter in the Windy City, he looked south to Florida, specifically Miami. Now, by that time, the situation in South Florida had changed dramatically. In 1926, a pair of devastating hurricanes burst the real estate bubble. "No malevolent providence," wrote the historian Frederick Lewis Allen, "bent upon the teaching of humility could have struck with more precise aim than the second and worst of these Florida hurricanes. It concentrated upon the exact region where the boom had been noisiest and most hysterical, the region about Miami." And you can see the devastation here. When Capone arrived in late 1927, he found a buyer's market and a city much more in need of his money than Los Angeles. So Capone rented a home in Miami Beach and set up an office downtown in the Hotel Ponce de Leon. He befriended the hotel's 24-year-old manager, Parker Henderson Jr., who showed him around and gladly did favors for him. Capone also went to the local police chief in Miami Beach to see if the town would treat him more kindly than Los Angeles. "Let's lay the cards on the table," Capone said. "You know who I am and where I come from. Do I stay or must I get out?" "You can stay," the chief said, "as long as you behave yourself." "I'll stay," Capone replied, "as long as I'm treated as a human being." Capone did his best to ingratiate himself, publicly calling Miami, quote, "the garden of America, the sunny Italy of the New World, where life is good and abundant, where happiness is to be had even by the poorest. I'm going to build or buy a home here," he added, "and I believe many of my friends will also join me. If I'm invited, I will join the Rotary Club." Now, Rotary never did invite him, but the mayor of Miami Beach, John Newton Lummis Jr., gladly welcomed him to town. Lummis also happened to be a real estate agent. And along with Parker Henderson, he helped Capone find the house here on Palm Island. So Capone made himself at home, finding the city much more hospitable than Chicago or Los Angeles. Miami's wide open gambling and permissive attitude toward those seeking to have a good time suited Capone perfectly, and he enjoyed the relief of not having people constantly trying to kill him. He seemed content to leave his business interests up north and run them from Miami Beach. After all, he had Parker Henderson cashing money orders for him and even buying and transporting guns that would later be connected to a gang murder in New York City. But in the wake of the failed land boom, Miami needed tourist dollars more than ever, and some prominent citizens worried that headlines like this about Capone running his criminal empire from Palm Island would scare visitors away. After all, Capone had given Chicago a reputation for lawlessness and violence that moved some legitimate businessmen to invest their money in other cities. Would Miami be next? Capone did his best to prove his good intentions by donating to local politicians and charities. When the community chests asked him for a $250 donation, he simply reached into his wallet and handed over a $1,000 bill. Shortly thereafter, the money returned to Capone in the form of a check, along with a letter from the organization describing, quote, very general and widespread opposition throughout the community to the chests accepting your gift, end quote. But Capone, by that point, had much bigger problems. Back in Illinois, a group of prohibition agents had begun investigating the outfit's bootlegging operations in Chicago Heights, which is a suburb about 40 miles south of the city. Among those agents was a 25-year-old Chicagoan who you see here named Eliot Ness. Ness had been a prohibition agent for about 2.5 years, but this would be his first major case. He and several other investigators went undercover in Chicago Heights, pretending to be corrupt and accepting bribes from local gangsters in order to earn their trust and figure out where they hid their illegal distilleries. This was a very dangerous assignment. An informant working closely with Ness was murdered, and at one point, Ness himself narrowly escaped getting a knife in his back. But after proving his abilities in Chicago Heights, Ness would be put in charge of the Prohibition Bureau's Special Capone Squad, later known as the Untouchables, the following year. So on January 6th, 1929, once the Prohibition agents had all the evidence they needed, Ness and the others led an enormous raid on the city of Chicago Heights. The town was so corrupt that the first place they hit was the local police station because they were afraid that the police would raise the alarm and warn the gangsters that to get out of town. So once the raiders had the cops behind bars, they fanned out to arrest dozens of suspects. 55 people would ultimately be convicted as a result of this enormous conspiracy case. And at the home of one conspirator, federal officials also seized financial records, which were turned over to the intelligence unit of the Treasury Department. Following the trail left by these records, Treasury agents soon connected some of Capone's top associates, including his brother Ralph, but not the big fellow himself, to thousands of dollars in illicit untaxed income, making it possible to bring them to court on tax evasion and tax fraud charges. As that was going on, the tax investigators started to take a much closer look at Al Capone. But back in Miami, Capone still had his eyes on a very different threat. The outfit had spent the past 5 years at war with their chief rivals in Chicago, the North Side Gang, now led by George Bugs Moran on the right here. Moran blamed the outfit for the murders of his close associates, Dean O'Banion and Jaime Weiss, among others, and his organization had repeatedly tried to kill Capone. So Capone decided on a preemptive strike. The outfit would send a hit squad dressed as police officers to a garage that the North Side Gang used as a meeting place. The phony cops would arrange it so Moran and his top associates, his board of directors, would be there and then pretend to raid the place. Once they had the North Siders disarmed and lined up against the wall, as if for arrest, they'd wipe their rivals out all at once. So on a blustery cold morning, February 14th, 1929, the plan went really spectacularly wrong. First, the lookouts across the street misidentified another gangster as Moran. So the real target of the killers showed up just in time to see what looked like police arriving on a liquor raid. Moran simply turned around and unwittingly escaped his own assassination. While inside, Capone's killers used Thompson submachine guns to execute 7 men, including a mechanic and an optometrist who were apparently in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, as it came to be called, sparked outrage around the country. Even in Chicago, where people tended to tolerate or even admire bootleggers like Capone, the shocking brutality of this crime simply proved too much to shrug off. No one would ever be tried or convicted for these murders, but law enforcement in Chicago would break new ground in the field of ballistic science to link the Tommy guns used in the massacre to one of Capone's hired killers, who ultimately was incarcerated for the rest of his life for another murder. Within a few years, Washington would respond to the massacre with the first federal gun control law in American history, which was deliberately designed to keep weapons like the Thompson submachine gun out of the hands of gangsters. But Capone, of course, had an airtight alibi. That very morning, while the shooting started on St. Valentine's Day, Capone happened to be here in downtown Miami at the Dade County Courthouse being questioned by Dade County Solicitor Robert Taylor and an assistant district attorney from New York. Even so, Capone, despite his denials, could not avoid being convicted of the massacre in the court of public opinion. Within a rather short period of time, became the conventional wisdom that he was behind in this. And the fact that he hosted a very large party at Palm Island 2 days later really only made him seem that much more of a monster in the press at that time. As the Los Angeles Times reported, Capone entertained with the prodigality of a Medici and the wistful pride of a small boy. His guests agreed that he had done things in a big way. So the very next day, Capone welcomes 2 more visitors to the house at Palm Island. Not these 2 guys here, but these were federal officers there to serve him a subpoena, ordering him back to Chicago to testify before a grand jury that was looking into the evidence that Ness and the other agents had gathered in Chicago Heights. Capone was in no hurry to return to the Windy City, certainly not in the middle of winter, and not when he was having such a good time in Florida. That same day, for instance, he watched boxer Jack Sharkey on the right here take on William Stribling at a prize fight in Miami Beach. Capone had a packed social calendar in many respects. So he got a local doctor to sign an affidavit claiming that Capone was too sick to travel, even though he regularly went to the races at Hialeah and had recently visited the Bahamas. So the feds postponed the hearing about a month, but they didn't believe the affidavit. Now Capone had J. Edgar Hoover's young Bureau of Investigation, it was not yet the FBI, looking into him for contempt of court, in addition to the prohibition agents going after his bootlegging operations and the Treasury men who were starting to probe his finances. Capone finally testified in Chicago on March 20th, 1929, though he made it very clear he'd rather be in Miami. Who wouldn't in March in Chicago? Down in Florida, they leave me alone, he told reporters. I go swimming when I want to. I go to the races when I want to. I do whatever I want to. That, of course, was precisely what had just gotten him into trouble. The feds held him there a week until Hoover's G-men had finished their investigations, gathering evidence of all the fun Capone had had in Florida and the Bahamas. And as Capone left the grand jury room for a final time, he found himself under arrest for providing a false affidavit. It was a relatively minor charge, and Capone quickly freed himself on a $5,000 bond. But now he was under federal indictment with more on the way. So Capone returned to Miami Beach, where later that spring, a fellow mobster joined him at the pool on Palm Island, Charles Lucky Luciano, seen here, of New York. We know that Luciano was there because of home movie film taken at the time, which was just part of the big auction of Capone family possessions that went on sale a week or 2 ago. We don't exactly know what Capone and Luciano discussed, but we do know that right around this time, Luciano, New York crime boss Frank Costello, and John Torrio were working to arrange a peace conference meant to finally end the gang war in Chicago. The 3 of them believed that organized crime should operate more quietly, like a true corporation, and they feared that Capone's growing notoriety would harm their business interests, not just in Chicago, but in New York, and Florida, and everywhere. So they wanted a peace treaty that would stop the killing that created so much bad press, while also limiting Capone's authority. Quietly, Torrio was taking back some of the power he'd given Capone just 4 years before. So the peace conference was held in Atlantic City, New Jersey, bringing together mobsters from Chicago and New York. American gangsters who once had turf battles street by street in certain neighborhoods and in certain cities were now openly organizing across state lines. Afterward, Capone spoke publicly about the agreement, implying that it had all been his idea, which likely suited Torrio, Costello, and Luciano just fine. But Capone still had rival gangsters gunning for him in Chicago. Torrio, who had retreated behind bars after the attempt on his life several years earlier, advised his protege that prison could be, quote, the safest place in the world. So a brief jail term would also, of course, temporarily get Capone out of the way while Torrio and the others tried to make this new agreement work. So conveniently enough, on his way back to Chicago, Capone was arrested in Philadelphia and charged with carrying a concealed handgun. The arrest was almost certainly a setup. The cops who had picked him up had apparently previously been his guests on Palm Island. And Capone quickly pleaded guilty, but he apparently did not expect the judge to sentence him to a full year in prison in Philadelphia, which took him out of circulation for the rest of 1929. So he got out the following March and found the country and the world had changed dramatically while he was in prison. Capone had become even more famous. That month, as you see, he became the first gangster to appear on the cover of Time magazine. But the stock market crash of 1929 and the onset of the Great Depression had brought the Roaring Twenties to a sudden and violent end. Americans no longer admired gangsters like Capone, and the rich men who had been national heroes in the 1920s now seemed more and more like villains to many Americans. As Liberty magazine would put it the following year, quote, a well-fed, busy, money-making America could wink at gangsters, but hungry men know no jokes, and there are many hungry men in the nation today, end quote. So as America began to rethink Al Capone and everything he had come to represent, this sudden shift in the culture would be most apparent. This fault line would reveal itself dramatically in Miami Beach. So when Capone tried to return home to Florida, he found that he'd become untouchable, not in the Eliot Ness sense, but in its original meaning. He'd become unwanted. He'd become an outcast. Doyle Carleton, the governor of Florida, put out an order banning him from the state, ordering every sheriff to arrest him on sight. Florida, Carleton said, as a playground, in the nature of things, is more liberal than other states, but it will not be a haven to crooks and criminals or headquarters for gangsters and gunmen. Capone will not establish headquarters in Florida. He will not take root here. But Capone, of course, had already taken root in Miami Beach. He was already using Palm Island as his headquarters. And he quietly made it back home in April, despite the governor's order, and told reporters that he just wanted to live in peace. I have no interest in politics, either in Chicago or Miami, he said, which was not true. I am here for the rest I think I deserve, and all I ask is to be left alone. I have done nothing in violation of the law in Miami, and I will not. Now, these words didn't placate the local authorities who kept trying to force Capone out of Florida. They raided the Palm Island house while he was away, finding liquor and a few of his associates. The Dade County State Attorney, Vernon Hawthorne, began proceedings to padlock the home as a public nuisance, calling it the scene of repeated liquor law violations frequented by law violators, habitual loafers, illegal dealers in liquor, and gamblers. Hawthorne also asserted that Capone's presence threatened property values in Miami Beach. Meanwhile, the Miami City Commission followed the governor's lead in directing local police to arrest Capone, even if they didn't have a warrant, which is not technically legal. The cops did as told, arresting Capone at least 3 times in 10 days without charging him with a crime. At one point, locking him in a windowless cell, refusing him a blanket, and preventing him from calling his attorneys. The city's director of public safety, Samuel McCreary, told Capone he could expect similar treatment whenever he appeared in public. I asked him, Capone later said, even if my mother and wife and kid was there, would he pick me up? And he said he would. I said, if you was me, what would you do? He said, I would not want to be you. Finally, after Capone's lawyers sued for false imprisonment, a judge threatened to put the safety director behind bars if he kept up the warrantless arrests. The local press also made it clear that they wanted Capone gone, running articles and editorials that described him as a clear and present danger to the community. A man with criminal associations with a record known worldwide of defiance of law and public decency is fast puncturing the very pith and fiber of our whole setup here, declared the Miami Daily News. There's nothing more persuasive, either for good or evil, than gold, and Greater Miami, in her indifference, has established here one of the most dangerous characters on earth, with all the power of a feudal lord. Ever concerned with his public image, Capone did his best to appear harmless. He and his wife, May, invited 50 of their son's friends to a pool party that you see here on Palm Island, making sure each of the kids brought written permission from their parents. According to the Chicago Tribune, the lawns were decorated and fried chicken, cakes, soda pop, balloons, and noisemakers were provided the youngsters, who spent the afternoon splashing in the pool and romping over the terraces, end quote. Soon after, Capone invited 50 prominent Miamians to a lavish banquet at the house. Their willingness to attend, to eat Capone's food and drink his liquor, suggested he perhaps wasn't quite the pariah some people wanted to present him as. But his guests didn't exactly want their names appearing in the newspapers either. So in mid-June, State Attorney Hawthorne appeared in court to defend the padlock order he placed on Capone's home. Hawthorne called several prominent Miami citizens to testify about the suspicious characters they'd seen at Palm Island or to describe the parties that they'd attended. For instance, Hawthorne asked R.B. Burdine, president of a Miami department store, if he'd seen alcohol served at Palm Island. "If I have to answer," Bardeen replied, "I will say I did. I saw plenty of it. A lot of champagne was served. It was very nice. Some drank scotch, but champagne was served continuously. I saw a sink literally loaded with champagne, and it looked very attractive. Some of the guests," he added, "were sober, and some were not so sober." None of that was technically illegal, since the 18th Amendment only prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol, not serving or consuming it in the privacy of one's home. Capone's attorneys, including J. Fritz Gordon, seen here on the left in Cuba with Capone and the mayor of Havana, did relatively little cross-examining, preferring to let Hawthorne's evidence speak for itself. But attorney Vincent Giblin did question Burdine on whether he'd considered inviting Capone into a higher social circle, sort of returning the favor. "I knew I could not carry Capone among my friends who would not have stood for it," Burdine admitted. "If I did, I would be severely criticized. I hate to say these things. I feel very much like a stool pigeon. I was at his house and this talk of a party came up. Someone suggested that I, as president of the country club, could arrange a party there, and I told them that I might. But of course, when I mentioned it out at the club, they would not even discuss the thing because they knew it would not do." "Why not?" Giblin pressed. "It wouldn't do," Burdine replied. "He is what we call a gangster. He doesn't fit in with my friends. I think he's dangerous to society and to the world at large." Capone clearly hated to hear that. He visibly bristled in court before his attorneys calmed him down. But this and other testimony ended up serving him well by highlighting the hypocrisy of a lot of these elite citizens who publicly denounced Capone while privately enjoying his hospitality. And the judge eventually rejected the padlock order, letting Capone stay on Palm Island. So the next time Capone appeared in court, however, he would not be so lucky. No less than the President of the United States, Herbert Hoover, was going to make sure of that. Hoover was actually a former neighbor of Capone's in Miami Beach. Before his inauguration, the president-elect spent the winter of 1929 at a home owned by J.C. Penney just across Biscayne Bay from Palm Island. Back then, presidents were inaugurated in March, not January. So Hoover was living roughly a mile from Capone on February 14th, the day of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And there are all sorts of stories of Hoover encountering Capone in Miami that winter, or being so annoyed by the noise of raucous parties at Palm Island that he decided to take the gangster down. But those stories are all myths. None of them are true. What is true is that Hoover took little notice of his former neighbor until March 1930, right around the time Capone got out of prison in Philadelphia, when some prominent Chicago businessmen asked the president to do something about the gangster who they believed had ruined their city's reputation. By that point, the stock market had crashed, the Depression had begun, and Hoover had proven himself unable or unwilling to do anything about it. He was very aware that he was going to stand for re-election in 1932. He needed a political victory. And having run on the promise to reform federal law enforcement and make prohibition work, Hoover treated Capone essentially as an opportunity to show the voters that his administration wasn't completely incompetent. Every morning before work, Hoover here liked to exercise with members of his cabinet by throwing a medicine ball around on the White House lawn. And in the spring of 1930, the president started pressing the members of his medicine ball cabinet on an issue that had suddenly become very important to him. "Have you got Capone yet?" Hoover would say. Remember now, I want that man Capone in jail. So federal agents, as we've seen, were already investigating Capone before the spring of 1930, but now orders came down from the White House to make this case a priority. The intelligence unit of the Treasury Department put their best man on the job, Special Agent Frank Wilson on the left here. Everybody, of course, knew Capone was rich. You only had to look at Palm Island to see that. But in order to convict him of income tax evasion, Wilson had to prove Capone had made a lot of money, which seemed practically impossible since Capone had carefully avoided leaving any kind of financial trail. He didn't sign checks generally. He didn't have bank accounts. He dealt in cash. So if there's no paper trail, how do you prove that he's made all this money? But Wilson had a secret weapon, someone inside Capone's organization who was willing to turn on him. E.J. O'Hare on the right here, also known as Fast Eddie, a lawyer who did business with the Chicago outfit. O'Hare's motives for betraying Capone were complex. He likely knew that Wilson could have built a tax evasion case against him if he didn't cooperate. But O'Hare also knew, like John Torrio and others in the Chicago outfit, that Capone's notoriety was increasingly making him a liability. It was making him really bad for their business. If O'Hare could steer the federal investigators toward Capone, he might be able to protect the gang's other business interests. That fall of 1930, Wilson came across a ledger that had been confiscated from an outfit casino back in 1926. Nothing in it directly implicated Capone. It didn't include his surname, but it did include the entry, quote, Frank paid $17,500 for Al, end quote. This could be evidence of taxable income, an essential element of a tax evasion case. But to prove that Al meant Al Capone, Wilson needed to find the bookkeeper who had written that entry. O'Hare gave him the man's name, Leslie Shumway. Now, all this talk about a ledger and finding Capone's bookkeeper might sound familiar if you've seen Brian De Palma's 1987 film here, The Untouchables. Maybe you're thinking, I know what happens next. The gang tries to spirit the bookkeeper down here out of Chicago by train, but Eliot Ness and the Untouchables rush to Union Station, get the big gunfight, stop him. No, none of this actually happened. In fact, Wilson found the bookkeeper in Miami, where Shumway was working as a cashier at a dog racing track, the Biscayne Bay Kennel Club. Rather than go in guns blazing like in the movie, Wilson came up with a plan to deceive his target. He arranged for Shumway to receive a subpoena asking him to testify about a non-existent company. Shumway, of course, didn't know anything about this, but the federal agent who served him the subpoena suggested it was probably a mistake, so he should just go to court and clear it up in person. When Shumway did that, Wilson sprang the trap and started questioning him about the ledger. If the bookkeeper refused to testify, Wilson hinted that he would tell the outfit Shumway was cooperating, which would surely seal the bookkeeper's fate. Eventually, Shumway gave in and provided Wilson with a sworn statement. Wilson now had the foundation of a tax evasion case against Al Capone. That same month, Capone finally went on trial in Chicago for contempt of court. Prosecution easily proved that Capone's doctor had sworn out a false affidavit and that the defendant had been having a great time in Miami and elsewhere when he was supposedly down with the flu. Capone was quickly convicted and sentenced to 6 months in the county jail, a little more than a slap on the wrist, but more was coming. Meanwhile, Eliot Ness and the Untouchables had begun attacking Capone's main source of income, his multi-million-dollar beer business, drawing up the outfit's revenue precisely when Capone could least afford it. So as the feds closed in, Capone increasingly retreated behind the walls of his Palm Island home. More and more isolated, he sort of let his hold on power begin to slip, while other members of the gang, less known to the public, were stepping in to take his place. Meanwhile, Capone would invite more than one journalist behind the walls of Palm Island to listen to him complain of how the government, the media, and everyone else were mistreating him. When the famous gossip columnist Walter Winchell visited in early 1931, he discovered Capone in the midst of a card game with a big pistol right at his side. "Here you are playing a game of cards with your friends," Winchell remarked, "but you keep a gun handy." "I have no friends," Capone replied. He went on to complain about the physician who'd given him the false affidavit, claiming that the doctor had turned on him. "Anybody I have wined and dined right in my own house cross me," Capone said. But Capone still kept whining and dining all those people at Palm Island. That May, Miami newspaper editor Fred Gerton, you see here, visited the Capone house for a party that he later described in a remarkable article here for the September 1931 issue of Startling Detective Adventures magazine. Gerton found, quote, a sort of sorrow permeating the Capone household, even before the recent difficulties with the government. It is a sort of silent rebellion against what they claim is unwarranted persecution, and perhaps there might be some justification in their complaint, end quote. I wanted a home, Capone declared. I bought one, and what happens? They tell me I'm not wanted, yet they take my money. The merchants take it, the butcher takes it, the grocer takes it, the builders take it. Then they threaten to arrest every member of my family that they can find. What do they want me to do? Get an airplane and live up in the clouds? End quote. Despite this outburst, Gerton believed Capone had resigned himself to spending some more time behind bars. Capone, he wrote, may be said to be rather more sober and serious than he was when I last saw him in his Miami mansion. But I think, too, that he is relieved. He now has an opportunity to step out of the picture for a time. There is a vast amount of supposition as to who will succeed him, Gerton added. Judging from the lack of interest that Al is showing in the matter, it may be supposed that he doesn't care who takes over the job. Still, Capone proved able to shake off his bad mood and play the perfect host, showing Gerton and his guests around Palm Island. Come on back and look at the pool, Capone said. I've just had a new diving platform put in. It costs 10 grand. My kid goes in every day, but he can't get his head wet on account of some trouble he's had with his ears. Look, I've got this bathhouse fitted with showers on both sides. If you want to go swimming, I've got plenty of suits. Gerton joined Capone, his family, and other guests for a sumptuous meal of spaghetti, steak, and squab, served on gold-rimmed china with golden tableware that Gerton judged to be, quote, worth a king's ransom. Capone's mood continued to improve as he expounded on the virtues of pure olive oil and imported Italian macaroni while his wife, May, ate silently, eyeing their guests. I like Florida, Capone said. I like it here because it's different. I want a home for my people. I want a place for my mother, my wife, my boy, and my friends. Why shouldn't a fellow have a place where he can go when he's tired? But Capone's paranoia remained. As Gerton left, he noticed a servant counting the golden forks and spoons. The Palm Island Capone is a peculiar man, Gerton observed. He seems to be obsessed with the idea that all the citizens of South Florida and all the tourists who visit this famous winter vacation land are watching him. Turns out Capone was right. Before Gerton sold his story to Startling Detective, he told Special Agent Frank Wilson about everything he'd seen at Palm Island. These are pages from Wilson's official report on the Capone case, summarizing a sworn statement from Gerton describing, quote, the lavish mode of living by Al Capone at his Miami Beach home. Gerton, as you can read here, said that he had known the defendant real well since 1928, had been entertained at his home about 30 times, that Capone regularly had 15 to 20 persons at his home for meals, that he had a gold dinner service, that Capone told him it cost about $1,000 per week for food, that he had a chef whom he had brought from Colosimo's restaurant in Chicago, that he had a Cunningham 16-cylinder Cadillac and 2 other autos, and that Gerton with several others had been Capone's guests on a boat trip to Bimini. So this and other evidence, this and other evidence of Capone's wealth became a major part of the tax evasion case against him. Wilson and his team documented the vast amounts of money Capone spent on food, clothing, and other luxuries. They tracked the money orders that Parker Henderson had cashed for him in Miami, as well as his attempts to donate $1,000 to the local community chest. And they recorded the tens of thousands of dollars he poured into the Palm Island property. $40,000 to buy the place, according to testimony from former Mayor Lummis, $1,500 for draperies, bread spreads, and upholstery work, according to a Miami Beach interior decorator, nearly $10,000 for furniture, $4,000 for the swimming pool, and $3,000 for the fence, $500 for the boat dock, and another $490 for the iron front gate, and a phone bill exceeding $8,000 for the years 1928 to 1931, and more than $5,000 on meat to feed Capone's family and dinner guests. Wilson found that as Capone's legal and financial troubles mounted in 1931, he tried to sell, quote, his home, the household furniture, 2 yachts, and a McFarlane automobile for $150,000, end quote. The federal government quickly put a lien on the property, which the Miami Real Estate Association only valued at $65,000, or roughly $1.2 million today, so far less than he'd invested in the property. The house that had once been a symbol of his success and sort of his ticket into Miami society had practically become Exhibit A in the government's case against him. So in June 1931, Capone was indicted for income tax evasion and conspiracy to violate the National Prohibition Act based on the investigations led by Frank Wilson and Eliot Ness. Capone initially pleaded guilty, having secretly worked out a plea bargain with the Justice Department that would ensure he spent no more than 2.5 years in prison. But then he bragged to reporters about what a great deal he'd made, and Judge James Herbert Wilkerson on the left here announced that he would not agree to such a short sentence. Capone quickly changed his pleas to not guilty, and Judge Wilkerson decided to move ahead with the income tax case, holding the prohibition case sort of in reserve in case Capone was acquitted. At trial that October, bookkeeper Leslie Shumway took the stand and testified to having kept the all-important ledger, but facing his former boss's withering stare, Shumway declined to directly tie Capone to the profits recorded in that book, saying he could only do so by hearsay. So with only circumstantial evidence that Capone had received taxable income, federal prosecutors buried the jury that you see here with evidence of Capone's expenditures, arguing in effect that the money simply had to come from somewhere. This wasn't actually a fair reading of tax law, at least at that time. And lawyers who later studied the case have argued that Capone on the merits probably should have been acquitted. But he and his organization had so corrupted law enforcement in Chicago that he could not be effectively held accountable for any of the other crimes to which he had been linked. The federal government essentially decided that this was their only shot. So they threw everything that they had at him. And combined with the defendant's notorious reputation, all of this testimony describing his lavish lifestyle in Miami Beach and Chicago was more than enough to convince a jury that was still sort of struggling to make ends meet during the Great Depression. 90 years ago tonight, they voted to convict Capone on, I believe, 5 of 23 counts. 1 week later, Judge Wilkerson sentenced him to 11 years in federal prison. Capone would only serve about 7.5 years of that sentence, much of it as one of the first inmates of a new prison on Alcatraz Island, San Francisco Bay, a maximum security facility that had been designed specifically for America's worst public enemies. In February 1938, after spending about 3.5 years on the Rock, Capone suffered a sudden mental breakdown, apparently brought on by a case of syphilis that he had contracted many years before. He endured spells of confusion, oddly compulsive behavior, and delusions. As one prison doctor reported, quote, "He is definitely expansive in mood and has developed extensive plans as to his activities after his release. He is going extensively into charity work and will build factories and industries, etc., to furnish employment to everyone needing it. He still has some disturbances of consciousness at times as his mind wanders and he hears God and the angels verbally reply to his prayers, etc. He, however, retains partial insight into these and says that he probably imagines some of the things that he hears." After trying and failing to cure Capone's syphilis by deliberately infecting him with malaria, which was the standard treatment at that time, federal officials transferred him to another prison at Terminal Island, California. Capone emerged from federal prison in November 1939, not long after E.J. O'Hare, the informant who had helped put him away, was shot to death mysteriously in Chicago. Rumors swirled that Capone might take back control of the outfit, and from a distance, as you can see, he sort of looked like his old self, but he wasn't at all, as those closest to him well knew. Capone's relatives brought him back to the home on Palm Island, which the federal government had repeatedly tried to seize for unpaid income tax until at the last minute, the family somehow always came up with the money. Capone was at times gentle and childlike, a loving father and grandfather. At other times, he believed he was back in Chicago during Prohibition, or that he was speaking to long dead gangsters who he may or may not have had murdered. Around strangers, he could become violently agitated, so he spent his final years as a recluse, mostly surrounded by close family. But when Capone suffered an attack of apparent stroke in January 1947, shortly after his 48th birthday, the local news media flocked to Palm Island, reporting every scrap of information they could learn about the illness, which soon developed into severe pneumonia. On the night of his duel with death, reported the Miami Herald, the big mansion had been brightly lighted as it had not been since Capone's heyday. For a time, it seemed that he might recover, and his doctor reported that the patient was entirely out of danger, barring complications. But then the pneumonia set in, and his health took a turn for the worse, and he was reported to be breathing through an oxygen mask. His lungs are pretty well filled, the doctor told reporters. I doubt very seriously if there is a chance for recovery. So Capone died at Palm Island in this room on January 25th, 1947, shortly before 7:30 p.m. As word of the death spread, reported the Miami Herald, a procession of automobiles began to arrive at the high-walled home where Capone lived out his anticlimactic years. More callers than the villa has ever had. Even in the lush times when gangsters used it as a holiday retreat, were admitted through the gates. And there was another procession too, the Herald went on, of people who could not go through the gate. These were the tourists, the curious, who formed a virtual promenade along the walks near the house, a regatta of rubbernecks walking and standing in groups to talk and laugh. It isn't known, the Herald added, if Capone will be buried in Miami, the city that didn't want him when he moved here, or Chicago, where he left a blot on the city's history long to be remembered. So Capone would ultimately be buried in Chicago, though his wife and son remained in Miami, and his widow stayed at the Palm Island house until she sold it in 1952, I believe. And despite the tourists who showed up at Palm Island on the night he died, despite all the headlines and editorials trying to make meaning of his death, there was a general consensus in press comment at that time that his era had passed, almost a sense that Capone was sort of already being forgotten. Reporters in Chicago found, quote, no tears apparent among his one-time henchmen, end quote, who would only send flowers to Capone's family on the QT. In Florida, a young child saw a Miami Daily News headline about the gangster's final illness and reportedly asked, Mom, who's Al Capone? But Capone, of course, would not be forgotten. And we arguably have another Miami resident to thank for that. So this person was a friend of Capone's only son, Albert, who everyone called Sonny, seen here on his wedding day in 1941. Back in the 1930s, when his father was in prison, Sonny Capone attended St. Patrick Catholic High School in Miami Beach, where he befriended a young Cuban exile, and I apologize for my pronunciation, named Desiderio Alberto Arnaz y Diacha III. You know him as Desi Arnaz. So fast forward about 20 years, and Arnaz had gone on to fame and fortune as the co-star and co-producer of the hit sitcom I Love Lucy, starring his wife, Lucille Ball. The immense success of that show allowed the couple to start developing other projects through their production company in Hollywood, Desilu. And in 1958, Arnaz decided to pick up the TV rights to a book that had been published the previous year, which was called The Untouchables. Eliot Ness on the left there, who had fallen on severely hard times, spent his final months co-writing a memoir about the Capone case, which he hoped would rescue his family from debt. It did not, at least not initially. Ness died of a heart attack shortly after the book came out, and The Untouchables didn't sell very well upon its release. Ness's widow called it a flop. But Arnaz saw promise, largely because he wanted to expand his abilities as an actor to try on some serious dramatic roles, and he thought he might make a great Eliot Ness. Fortunately, his wife shot that idea down, but Arnaz kept developing the show as a producer. And shortly after the production was announced, he received a phone call from his old friend, Sonny Capone, who was still living in Miami Beach and operating a restaurant there. Why you, Sonny asked. Why did you have to do it? In his memoir, Arnaz recalled that, quote, Desilu was about to become a public company, which meant I had to think about the best way to serve our stockholders. It was a book I knew somebody was going to do. It had to make a great 2 hours with the possibility of becoming a hell of a series. Indeed, Arnaz likely knew that a competing project, a biopic starring Rod Steiger here as Capone, the first film to tell his story using his real name, would soon go into production. That same year, Billy Wilder was going to use the St. Valentine's Day Massacre as a plot point in Some Like It Hot, starring Marilyn Monroe. So the Roaring Twenties, in short, were coming back into vogue, and Arnaz was a businessman. Sonny, he said, if I don't do it, somebody else is going to do it. And maybe it's better that I'm going to do it. Sonny did not agree. These television plays and movies about my father can only hurt my mother and my own family, he told the Miami Daily News. I don't see why we should have to go on taking it on the chin. We've been bearing this cross all these years. I think it's high time that we got a little peace. So The Untouchables debuted as a two-part episode of the Westinghouse Desilu Playhouse in April 1959, starring Robert Stack as Eliot Ness and Neville Brand as Al Capone, playing him with an Italian accent for some bizarre reason. As Arnaz had expected, the two-parter proved a smash hit, and Desilu quickly spun it off into an ongoing series. Capone's widow, son, and sister sued for damages, claiming that Desilu had invaded their privacy, appropriated Capone's name and likeness, and damaged the value of his estate with fictitious scenes, quote, portraying him kissing a blonde girlfriend in his private office, being in a hotel room with another woman, and singling out a bar girl and a dancer in a cabaret for special favors, etc., end quote. The lawsuit was not successful. So The Untouchables ran on television for 4 seasons. Along with Brian De Palma's 1987 film adaptation, it soon eclipsed other fictional versions of this story, not to mention the facts of what actually happened, to really define the public's memory of Al Capone and Eliot Ness. There was no longer any chance that either of them would be forgotten. But while the original 2-part pilot stuck somewhat close to the story as recounted in Ness's memoir, the need for additional material to keep the show going pushed The Untouchables further and further into the realm of fiction. And the 1987 movie didn't even try to get the facts straight, treating the story deliberately as myth and legend instead of actual history. But the house that still stands on Palm Island reminds us that these were real people who actually lived and whose stories still impact us in the present. The federal effort to bring down Al Capone, in which the Palm Island house played such a key role, as we've seen, changed the nature of American law enforcement. Prosecutors continued to use the same strategy developed by people like Frank Wilson of going after financial records to indict gangsters and racketeers and terrorists and others today. And Eliot Ness and The Untouchables set a new standard for professionalism that federal agents still strive to live up to. And in fact, he's now memorialized in the headquarters of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, which is the successor agency to the Prohibition Bureau. So that's sort of the continuing importance of the story and the way that it looms large in our national mythology and memory is why my co-author and I, as I said, wanted to try and peel back the layers of myth and see what actually happened and recapture the reality of these two men as best we can. And if you'd like to know more, this would be a pretty good place to start. So that's all I have prepared. I don't know if Daniel wants to jump back in. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to take a shot. But thank you all again for spending your Sunday evening with us. And I hope it was worth it.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much, Brad. And that was a great presentation. I am now going to be looking at the Q&A or the chat. So if you could just bear with me. If anyone has questions, please put it in the chat or the Q&A. I also wanted to mention in the beginning of the talk, we asked people where they were joining from. So we have people joining us from Brickell, Venice, Florida, Sebastopol, California, Miami Beach, Eagle River, Wisconsin, a lot of Miami Beach people, Broward, Ontario, Philadelphia, Toronto, and many more. So we're very happy to have shared this evening with all of you. So I wanted to ask a question from Scott, and he asks, did O'Hare invent the mechanical rabbit used at dog tracks? Did he and Al own some tracks? Thank you.
Yeah, O'Hare didn't. It's a great question. O'Hare didn't invent the mechanical rabbit, but he controlled the patent on it. And this and Scott seems well informed. For those who don't know, this is the device at dog racing tracks, like where Leslie Shumway worked. It was a device that the dogs would chase, and this was how. I guess we can put this down. But this was how they would get the dogs to run at the races. And so, yeah, he owned, I believe, interests in tracks alongside Capone and other members of the Chicago outfit. And that was sort of how he was an attorney, but he wasn't really a mob lawyer, as he's sometimes been characterized. He wasn't defending these gangsters in court. He had this control of his patent and used it to make a lot of money in association with the gangsters. Interestingly enough, as some of you may or may not know, O'Hare, even though he made his money in organized crime, he had a son who he was very concerned about not following him down the same path. And this son, whose nickname was Butch O'Hare, ended up serving in the military, flying planes during World War II, winning, I don't know if it was the Medal of Honor, it was some high medal. It's in the book, before he was killed in action during World War II. And he is the person who O'Hare Airport in Chicago is named after. So as we talk about at the end of the book, and Daniel and I are having this conversation beforehand, that, when Chicago, the city of Chicago, has apparently, with deliberate effort, tried to erase or knock down or eliminate buildings that are associated with Capone's career, as if they could sort of remove him from the city's legacy. But just like O'Hare's name being on the airport, just like all of these, the mayor of Chicago, Anton Cermak, who also has a connection to Miami, his name was on the street where Capone's hotel headquarters used to be located. He's baked into the DNA of that city, just as hopefully we've shown. Capone himself is, I think, baked into the DNA of Miami Beach. And so the assertion that has been made that you need to knock the home down to remove this stain, even if it were good policy, it wouldn't work. But thank you for that question. I hope I answered it.
Thank you, Brad. So we've had a couple of questions from Linda, Tina, and others about Al Capone's wife and his family life in general, and and any other info you have about that, and how they lived on Palm Island.
Well, yeah, Capone and his wife May, who was Irish, of Irish extraction, met in Brooklyn. Became involved there. Their son, Sonny, was born in Brooklyn as well before Capone moved to Chicago. At the time, that would have been a really boundary crossing romance, an Italian and an Irish girl. That there was a lot of ethnic conflict in cities like New York and Chicago. So that was crossing a real red line for a lot of people. But Capone, of course, was not a faithful husband as strictly defined, but he does certainly seem to have loved his wife and loved his son. And his justification for a lot of what he did professionally would have been protecting them and presenting as good a life as he could for them. There's an exchange in the Fred Gertten article that I quoted from, where he's sort of, a lot of the Capone family members, May Capone, and I think his mother may have been there, but they're sort of sitting around, and somebody says, you have a house in Chicago, don't you, Mr. Capone? And his wife interjects, how would he know? He's never been there in the past 5 years or something like that. Which I think gets to sort of, there's an element of their relationship that you wouldn't normally see publicly, because she was very, there's photos when she was, I think, going to visit him in Alcatraz, where she got cornered by press photographers, and she's pulling her coat over her head so she doesn't get photographed. She really wanted to stay out of the public eye. Was apparently hurt by his infidelities when she became aware of them. Was apparently very concerned that their son not follow him into the family business, which he didn't. I think trying to provide as stable a life and normal a life as was possible under the circumstances, which was not stable at all. Cared for him. You can read, I don't know how available they are. They're certainly in his prison file at the National Archives. But the letters he would write Capone would write to his son and to his wife from Alcatraz, sort of professing his love for them and talking about wanting to return to the house on Palm Island and just sort of get away from it all and spend his time with them. So yeah, in his way, certainly he loved them, and they clearly loved him. His activities made him absent and certainly complicated their lives. But the family stuck by him and continued to, as you saw, defend his legacy after he was gone.
Great. So next, I guess is more of a comment than a question. Sarah wrote, "So happy that you made this presentation just as we're actively fighting to save this home from demolition. This is truly a historic home that matters and deserves preservation." I think
I agree. Thank you for fighting that fight.
Right. I was going to say, even for those who may have doubted it, I would be hard pressed after seeing this great presentation to not see this as anything other than historic. Karen asked, do we have a sense of the people or the family owning the property presently? Do they indicate that they'll honor its history and beauty? That's a good question. I could take that one. So yes, the property has been purchased by a trust. We do not know the ownership behind the trust. In Florida, that happens a lot, that these very expensive properties are purchased through a trust. However, the new owners have hired an attorney, and we have been in touch with the attorney, and I know that the city of Miami Beach has been in touch with the attorney, and I think the discussions are happening now about what might be the fate of the house. We hope that we can work with the owners and demonstrate that there is a value in preserving this home and that it could be beautifully updated if needed, while still maintaining its place in history. And so I would say to that, stay tuned, and we'll definitely be keeping everyone posted on that. Carolyn Klepser, one of our great historians, mentioned that you can see Capone's private and furnished cell at the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia.
Yeah, it's a great. Oh yeah, and they have a staff historian there who helped us when we were working on the book. Yeah, I would recommend, if you're ever in Philadelphia, it's the prison. Eastern State is actually rather close to downtown, so it's easy to get to, and the whole facility is really well preserved and presented, not just the Capone cell, but telling the story of the history of prisons in the United States. So yeah, I would second that. I would highly recommend it. Of course, Alcatraz itself, if you're ever in San Francisco, is now a national park site. And you can see his cell, which was not nearly as well appointed as his cell in Philadelphia. But yeah, that's another place I would highly recommend if you want to dig more deeply into this story.
Sounds good. So Casey Pickett, who's also a great local historian, he asks, do you know who purchased the home video when Luciano visited Capone in 1929?
I do not. I have not seen it. I would like to. If this person happens to be on the chat, send me an email. Yeah, I know from the from going through the website, the auction listings, they had some screenshots, and so I would very much like to know more myself, but I can't illuminate you at present.
On that note, I wanted to mention that one source of good information for us as we first were studying the house when the owners were contemplating demolition was the Wolfson archives. We found some footage from the 1950s of the property when it was listed for sale at that time. And through that video footage, we were able to actually counter the argument that had been put forward that the home had been dramatically altered. So we were basically able to show clips of that video and transpose it on what the house looks like now and demonstrate that at least that argument was not as solid So these historical videos are so important, I think, for this type of effort as well.
Absolutely. And on
Okay.
that,
Yeah.
people often, and when I do these sort of things, everybody remembers the Geraldo Rivera, Al Capone's vault. Maybe more in Chicago because that was a huge deal in Chicago. But all people remember about that show is the end, understandably. But I watched it. The whole thing was available online when we were doing the book, and it's actually like until the final 10 minutes. It's a pretty good documentary. And Geraldo went to Palm Island. He spoke to, I think, a caretaker who recalled being there. After Capone got out of prison, so when he was sort of debilitated. And around the Lexington Hotel, and you sort of get to see inside his office, which you never get to see. So just to Daniel and others who are interested in the history of the house, if you are able to seek that show out, it's worth doing.
That sounds great. I know a lot of our listeners here are very good at research, and I think you've just given some good new ideas for that
My
too.
people, my kind of guys.
Okay, so moving on, we got just a few more left. William Platt asked a question that I was hoping would be asked. Is there any interaction between Meyer Lansky and Al Capone in Miami Beach that you're aware of?
That I'm aware of, no. It wouldn't surprise me because again, it's a fairly small community, and there was more and more interaction happening between mobsters in different cities, but I'm not aware of any specific encounters.
Okay, and if any of the other historians listening in have any anything to add, feel free to add that in the chat. That'd be an interesting connection. Here's an interesting question from Meg. Do you believe Capone was guilty of human trafficking? No one seems to care. And then she said, I see this as similar to preserving the story of General Lee. Seems like a traitor and murderer, even if he was famous. So what would be your kind of response to that?
I think, yeah, I don't know of any specific evidence of trafficking has been described. It is certainly the case that, particularly in Cicero, which was a suburb to the west of Chicago, and that's where sort of, particularly in the early to mid 20s, where Capone was associating himself, where there was a large vice operation, and there was a journalist, a guy by the name of Robert St. John, who essentially went undercover in one of the brothels and was trying to do an expose, and he ran his own little newspaper in the city of Cicero, and ended up being in great conflict with the Capone organization. We sort of tell his story in the book, but he goes undercover in one of the brothels and interviews the women who were working there. And again, I don't know if anybody necessarily being brought across state lines, because that would have been another federal issue that the Justice Department may or may not have looked into. But certainly they had these enormous they were very industrialized. There was I think St. John even specifically, we may use the quote in the book, but he talks about Capone turning vice into big business, and how how offensive the St. John found that, and that's why he was telling the story. So certainly Capone was profiting off of the exploitation of girls and young women, while at the same time giving interviews as he did. There's a very cracked and bananas interview he gives to, I think it was American Magazine, Liberty Magazine, right before he goes to prison, where he's talking about how we need to get rid of birth control, and if we get rid of birth control, America will be as strong as Italy. And it's just sort of bananas, but he goes into all this detail about how his views on the proper place of women in society. So yeah, he's not an admirable individual in any respect. Certainly I would put Robert E. Lee in that category for different reasons, but there's a difference, I would argue, between having a statue of somebody and preserving a building that is connected to an important part of our history. So Robert E. Lee's home in Arlington, which became the site of Arlington National Cemetery, is still there. It's still there's the museum in Richmond that tells. I think the White House of the Confederacy is now part of the National Civil War Museum or something like that, but does a great job of preserving that history. But that's not the same thing as putting him on a pedestal in the center of town. So that would be my, these homes and buildings have a historical value, but I would certainly hope we're not gonna put up a statue of Al Capone in Miami or anywhere else for those reasons.
Yeah, and I tend to agree with that. I think the idea of like a statue in a public site, in the air, meant to kind of honor a person over others, I think has one kind of, use. But this is different in that it's a structure, it's a site, it's a home. But it's obviously an interesting part of the conversation as this process unfolds. So now I see a question about, do we know, or in your readings, did you come across Al Capone and his connection to Espanola Way? That's a Spanish village in Miami Beach. It looks like a kind of like a Mediterranean Italian village, but we've heard a lot of sort of, and they may be urban legends or not, but that he spent a lot of time there at the bars. So wondering if you came across anything like that in your research.
I don't I don't know off the top of my head. I mean, it's difficult in Miami in particular because, by the time he bought the house and he's away for so much of 1929 and he comes back, and as you've seen, by that point he's really a national figure. So it's difficult for him to move around unobserved, and he sort of more and more was at the house. So yeah, I don't know of any. That certainly doesn't ring any bells. I don't know of anything specifically. If you come up with any contemporary sources that would make a difference, but I can't unfortunately shed any light on that one way or the other.
Okay, well, thank you. Let's see. There was one last minute. Oh yeah, Adrian mentioned that in the 50s, Espanola Way was just a street that wasn't, I think she meant that wasn't close to cars at the time. And she said there were no restaurants, but I think this would be like more in the mid-20s that he may have gone there. But then again, a lot of these figures, they went to many places, and there wasn't always necessarily like a news article about it.
Yeah.
But, so sometimes those stories they pass on, but we're not always able to confirm, for certain every place. But we could sort of imagine him being there and enjoying his liquor.
I mean, he did apparently. There were a select number of times after he got out of prison where the family would take him around to nightclubs and restaurants and things. Apparently. But again, he, because of his condition by that time, those trips seem to have been rather few and far between. So he wasn't entirely restricted to the house after 1939, but yeah, he spent most of the final, 8 years of his life there.
Oh, here, Jeff Donnelly, one of our great historians, chimed in and said that Dudley Whitman denied any connection between Capone and Espanola Way. And I believe that's Whitman of the family that developed Espanola Way. Jeff, I don't know if you could tell us when that happened or not, but that's interesting. A lot of people definitely don't want to be tied to Al Capone. And it's interesting, sometimes I wonder, the building card in the city of Miami Beach, it's blank on the name of the architect. And it may be that it literally is one of the oldest homes that still exists in Miami Beach. So maybe they just did not have that information. But part of me wonders if maybe at some point people tried to, separate themselves. Did you see that in, well, I mean, you talked about it in your talk about the governor and and so many groups trying to sort of say that they did not want any affiliation with him. Meanwhile, I think St. Patrick's, you mentioned that he helped them financially. That's our local.
Yeah, he gave to a lot of charities and a lot of, I mean, his son went to St. Patrick's, so I assume they paid tuition. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, it's, there are, I'm talking about Chicago now, not Miami, but there are certainly, when you go looking for certain documents in archives and municipal, there are gaps that may be for various reasons, including the organization not wanting certain information to be public. But again, that's Chicago, so you don't, Chicago operates by its own rules in a lot of ways. I don't know. I mean, I'm not I certainly don't know as much about Miami's municipal archival practices as you or some of the folks on the chat. But I do think, as we sort of tried to talk about, there was this dichotomy where there was a lot of public outrage about Capone's presence, about not wanting him in Miami for what he was bringing to the city's reputation at a time when it was trying to improve its image, just like he was in some ways. And yet he wasn't entirely unwelcome. And so, yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if some of that was going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And even to think about Prohibition being this period of like 1920 to, I think it was through 33.
Yeah, December of 33.
Yeah, and I mean, that was such an important period in the growth of South Florida, Miami Beach, Miami. And in fact, a large percentage of the buildings that still exist here are from the era of the 1920s, 1930s. There was such a boom that I think Prohibition, had a big part in, as well as real estate. But do you go into that in your book?
We talk a little bit about Miami, not at great length, because the subtitle of the book is The Battle for Chicago. So it's Chicago is, I think, much more of a character in the book. But yeah, we talk about all of sort of what I've been describing, how the land boom went bust, how the city suffered through the hurricanes, and sort of it was this preview of what was going to happen in 1929 with the stock market crash. So they were trying to bring in more tourism, more interest, and so Capone is initially welcome, and then he's not, but he still kind of is. And how people like Capone and John Torrio and others continued to have business interests in the gambling and the horse racing and the dog racing that was going on in and around Miami. Leslie Shumway is, curiously still working in mob-connected gambling operations as late as like the 50s. He turns up in the Kefauver, which is very curious that this guy who testifies in open court against a mobster is sort of welcomed back into the fold. And we talk about reasons why that might have been. So Miami's a secondary character, but it's definitely in the book.
But in a way, your talk has sort of illustrated that there is a lot of history probably yet to be untapped. And so I see this as an interesting topic for further exploration.
Maybe we should do an archaeological dig at the Palm Island house. Who knows what we might find?
Look for that safe that Geraldo couldn't find, right?
Yeah, right.
So Carolyn Klepser writes that Miami Beachers may remember the Popham home on Star Island facing the causeway that was demolished in 2014. Capone bought the Palm Island house using a pseudonym from J.W. Popham. It was originally built by Clarence Bush, no relation to the beer company, whose house across Palm Avenue was demolished in 2001. Palm Island doesn't have a very good record of, I assume she means of saving homes, which, we're trying to counter. And then Jeff Donnelly writes that Dudley Whitman, son of William F. Whitman, original developer of Espanola Way, knew and hung out with Sonny Capone, Al Capone's son. Whitman has said that he knows nothing about any connection between Al Capone and Espanola Way. This is even more telling since the Whitmans, quote unquote, took back the Espanola Way properties from NBT Roney during the Depression. And that's according to an interview from 2005. So that is interesting. Thank you, Jeff. And then Scott writes that I read that Sonny owned a restaurant on Collins Avenue and the building is still there. Las Vegas Cuban cuisine around 69th Street. So that's very interesting.
That sounds about right. I mean, it was, the address I think is out there, or it's somewhere in the research. Collins Avenue rings a bell. So I can't 100% confirm that. The restaurant was called Ted's Grotto or The Grotto when Sonny was running it. Like I said, around 58, 59 when the Untouchables TV series happened. But yeah, that sounds right. And again, maybe some of the people in the chat could do more digging to confirm exactly where the restaurant was located.
Sounds great. Well, I wanted to say thank you again, Brad, and we are also hoping to bring you to Arteca Weekend to talk about the radio, which, by the way, is going to be the topic, the focus of our 45th annual Arteca Weekend, January 14th to 16th, 2022. It will be our first in-person Arteca Weekend since 2020, when we celebrated the centennial of women's suffrage right before the shutdown. So we are very excited to have you here tonight and thankful for your time. And if anyone hasn't seen Brad's letter to the Miami Herald about the home, it's really a great letter that lays out the many reasons why this home merits historic preservation. And definitely check out his book, The Untouchables. And
Scarface and The Untouchable.
Sorry, Scarface and The Untouchable.
No, Eliot Ness wrote The Untouchables. So yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm
it's a good book. It's worth your time, but it's not mine.
Yeah, we should have like the graphic up there. And I actually just bought it, so I look forward to reading that as well. And thank you all for joining. For those of you who are in town, tomorrow at 6 o'clock, we'll have our second in the Art of Architecture lecture series at the Miami Beach Community Church on Lincoln Road. And so we'll look forward to seeing you there. We also will have our next Lapidus lecture on October 28th.